The phrase state-sponsored terrorism sounds absolute, but in real-world security policy it often describes a spectrum. At one end, there is direct command and control. In the middle, there is facilitation, selective protection, or deliberate non-interference. At the other end, there is institutional weakness that produces similar outcomes even without explicit orders. The debate around Pakistan sits in that spectrum, which is why it has lasted for decades. Critics argue that certain militant organizations survived not by accident but because they were considered strategically useful against regional rivals. Pakistani officials, by contrast, emphasize that Pakistan itself has suffered immense terrorist violence and has conducted major counter-terror operations. Both claims can be true at once. A state can be attacked by some militants while accused of tolerating others. Understanding this duality is essential. This is not a simple story of one unified policy carried out consistently by every institution. It is a story about competing priorities inside a national security framework, where short-term tactical gains were often weighed against long-term regional stability, and where that trade-off repeatedly produced mistrust abroad. The accusations against Pakistan did not come from a single adversary, which is one reason they carried global weight. Over time, neighboring states like India and Afghanistan repeatedly alleged cross-border militant support, while Western governments including the United States and European partners raised related concerns about safe havens and permissive networks. The central allegation was consistent, that militant groups could recruit, fundraise, train, and plan on Pakistani territory with varying degrees of interference. International assessments often framed this as a governance and will problem, not merely a capacity problem. In other words, if a state can rapidly target organizations that threaten it internally but struggles for years against groups focused externally, outside observers infer selective enforcement. Pakistan's response has long been that its geography, conflict legacy, and internal insurgencies created an extraordinarily complex battlefield. That argument has merit, but complexity alone does not settle the policy question. External actors judge by pattern and persistence, which groups are dismantled, which groups rebrand and survive, and whether crackdowns are sustained when diplomatic pressure fades. That pattern-based scrutiny is why the controversy never fully disappeared. Geography is central to this issue, especially the Afghanistan-Pakistan border belt. For years, analysts described parts of this region as operational depth for militant actors. Harsh terrain, tribal networks, and historically weak state penetration made it difficult to enforce monopoly control over violence. But difficult is not impossible, and that distinction matters. Safe havens are not created by terrain alone, they are sustained by logistical ecosystems including money channels, local facilitation, recruitment pipelines, ideological cover, and intermittent political protection. Once these ecosystems mature, eliminating them requires coordinated intelligence, policing, courts, and administrative reform, not just military raids. Critics said Pakistan often applied force asymmetrically, targeting anti-state militants more aggressively than groups oriented toward external theaters. Pakistani narratives emphasized that many operations did occur and that losses were severe. Yet from an international perspective, selective pressure still looked like strategic calibration rather than full-spectrum dismantling. That perception hardened over time and shaped how every new incident was interpreted, because once a country is seen as a place where some armed actors can survive for strategic reasons, future denials face a steep credibility barrier. Kashmir became the most politically charged arena in this debate. India has consistently argued that Pakistan-backed networks helped sustain insurgent violence. Through financing, training, infiltration routes, and ideological mobilization. Pakistan has rejected claims of directing terrorism, framing Kashmir as an unresolved political dispute and highlighting local grievances inside Indian-administered territory. This clash is not only about evidence but also about vocabulary. One side speaks of proxy warfare, the other invokes resistance and disputed sovereignty. However, high-casualty attacks repeatedly shifted international attention from narrative framing to operational traces, where networks were based, where leaders resurfaced, and how sanctioned organizations adapted under pressure. Even when legal attribution in public remained contested, cumulative intelligence assessments influenced diplomatic behavior. The policy consequence is crucial. Unresolved territorial conflict plus tolerated militant infrastructure creates a crisis machine. Any attack can trigger military signaling, domestic political escalation, and compressed decision timelines under public anger. In that environment, deniability may offer temporary tactical space, but it also increases strategic instability because trust mechanisms are already weak and each side assumes worst-case intent from the other. By the late 2000s, major policy analysts in Washington described Pakistan as one of the most active state sponsors or enablers of militant groups, depending on the criteria used. These judgments mattered beyond academia. Think tank framing influences congressional debates, military aid conditions, intelligence cooperation norms, and media narratives. When analysts argue that a formal partner is simultaneously helping counter-terror campaigns and tolerating selected militants, the relationship becomes structurally distrustful. Every briefing is filtered through a double question: is this cooperation sincere, and is it comprehensive? Pakistan then faces a paradox of dependence and suspicion, receiving support in some areas while being pressured in others. This dual status shaped years of U.S.-Pakistan relations. Officials needed Pakistan for logistics and regional access, especially during Afghan war phases, yet feared that parts of the same ecosystem preserved actors who undermined broader security goals. Strategic ambiguity might deliver short-term leverage, but it carries institutional cost. Once key partners internalize a selective enforcement model, confidence decays, conditionality rises, and diplomatic room narrows even when genuine counter-terror actions are undertaken. Public remarks by Pakistani leaders gave this debate unusual momentum because they appeared to acknowledge elements previously dismissed as hostile propaganda. In 2018, former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif suggested Pakistani-linked responsibility in the context of the 2008 Mumbai attacks and referenced concerns tied to Lashkar-e-Taiba. In 2019, Prime Minister Imran Khan stated that tens of thousands of armed militants existed in Pakistan and implied previous underreporting. These statements were not comprehensive legal admissions of a unified state doctrine, but they materially shifted the burden of proof conversation. When senior leaders concede scale or linkage, international audiences no longer ask whether a problem exists, they ask why it persisted and who benefited from ambiguity. Domestic political context still matters. Such comments can emerge from civil-military friction, diplomatic repositioning, or attempts to reset relations with major powers. But regardless of motive, they became part of the evidentiary landscape. They reinforced long-standing external assessments that militant infrastructure was not marginal or accidental. In policy terms, acknowledgement raises expectations. If the depth is known, then accountability is measured by dismantling outcomes, not by rhetorical distancing alone. The Abbottabad raid in 2011 became the defining credibility shock. Osama bin Laden, the most wanted global jihadist leader, was found in a compound near Pakistan's military academy and killed by U.S. forces in a unilateral operation. That location transformed a counter-terror event into a strategic trust rupture. International observers saw two troubling possibilities: either Pakistani authorities knew and tolerated his presence, or they did not know despite proximity to highly sensitive military infrastructure. Both scenarios damaged Pakistan's reliability profile. Pakistani officials rejected complicity and emphasized national sacrifices against terrorism, but reputational logic is unforgiving. Counter-terror partnerships run on confidence that declared priorities align with territorial realities. Abbottabad suggested a severe mismatch, whether from collusion, fragmentation, or failure of state visibility. The raid also signaled how little trust existed at the operational level, since the U.S. proceeded without prior Pakistani notification. In diplomacy, unilateral action on Allied soil is a last resort indicator that confidence channels have collapsed. Abbottabad therefore did more than expose one fugitive, it crystallized years of suspicion into a single image that altered global perception for the next decade. Recent incidents show that this issue remains active, not historical. After the 2025 Pahalgam attack in Jammu and Kashmir that killed civilians, India accused Pakistan of involvement while Pakistan denied backing. This cycle repeats with familiar stages: attack, accusation, denial, international calls for restraint, and a renewed contest over attribution. What makes each episode dangerous is the fusion of grief, nationalism, and preloaded mistrust. Attribution in real time is hard, yet political systems often demand immediate certainty. In such conditions, prior credibility heavily shapes current judgment. States perceived as having tolerated militant proxies in the past face intensified skepticism in the present, even before full evidence is public. That dynamic can accelerate escalation because denials are discounted and retaliatory pressure rises domestically. It also undermines crisis management tools like hotlines and confidence-building mechanisms. If one side assumes the other is operating through deniable actors, every incident becomes both a tragedy and a strategic message, whether intended or not. The result is a persistent volatility where unresolved historical patterns continuously destabilize current diplomacy. In 2025, Defense Minister Khwaja Muhammad Asif said Pakistan had done the dirty work of Western nations for decades when challenged on support for militant groups. That framing introduces an uncomfortable but important layer. Great power incentives have historically intersected with local proxy ecosystems, especially during anti-Soviet and post-9/11 phases. External sponsorship, funding flows, and strategic tolerance did help build armed networks across the region. But explanation is not exoneration. Shared origins do not erase sovereign responsibility for later choices, particularly when groups evolve into transnational threats or target civilians. Asif's remark is significant because it functions both as defense and concession. Defense, because it diffuses blame across international actors that benefited from militant utility at earlier stages. Concession, because it implicitly accepts prolonged state interaction with such actors as a matter of policy reality. For analysts, the key takeaway is that proxy infrastructures are rarely local-only projects. They are often co-produced by regional and global incentives. Yet once institutionalized, they become domestically entrenched and harder to unwind, creating long-term security liabilities for all stakeholders, including the state that once viewed them as assets. Beyond diplomacy, the human and institutional costs are profound. Recurrent militancy linked to cross-border agendas normalizes emergency politics, expanded security powers, reduced civic trust, polarized media ecosystems, and constant fear in vulnerable regions. Civilian communities pay repeatedly through casualties, trauma, disrupted schooling, and constrained economic opportunity. Border militarization diverts resources from development, while recurring crises deter investment and regional integration that could reduce conflict incentives. Pakistan itself illustrates the blowback problem acutely. Armed ecosystems cultivated for external leverage can fragment, radicalize, and eventually target domestic institutions, proving difficult to contain once organizational loyalties split. This is why many security scholars reject the notion of stable proxy management. Militant actors are not static tools, they adapt, compete, and mutate ideologically. Command relationships weaken over time, and deniable networks become autonomous threat actors. What appears tactically useful in one decade can become a strategic disaster in the next. The cumulative effect is a security trap. States retain ambiguous relationships out of fear of short-term loss, but that ambiguity steadily increases long-term instability and reputational isolation. If strategic ambiguity is the problem, credible change requires strategic clarity backed by durable enforcement. That means dismantling all designated militant infrastructures regardless of target orientation, prosecuting financial and logistical facilitators through transparent legal processes, and preventing rebranding cycles where banned groups resurface under new names. It also requires aligning intelligence priorities so that no actor is preserved for geopolitical utility. Internationally, credibility returns only through consistency over years, not episodic crackdowns after major attacks. Regionally, de-escalation remains difficult without reciprocal steps from rivals, but reciprocal complexity cannot justify selective tolerance at home. The core policy lesson from this history is stark. Proxy militancy may promise leverage, yet it corrodes state capacity, degrades diplomatic trust, and magnifies civilian risk. In the long run, every actor loses strategic freedom because crises become frequent, narratives harden, and retaliation pathways multiply. The debate over Pakistan and state-sponsored terrorism, therefore, is not just about assigning blame for the past. It is about whether regional security can move beyond deniable violence toward accountable statecraft before the next crisis arrives. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.